Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out live onto your smartphones, laptops, iPads and living room TVs. My name's Luke and I'm the Pervasive Media Studio producer. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for you to hear from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that excite us. An especially big welcome to any of you out there who are new to the studio, for whom this might be the first time you'll be engaging with what we do. For all of you, here's a little bit more about what we do. The studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of West England and University of Bristol. And we're a home for early stage ideas and companies and a meeting place of both creative and commercial industries. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, and it's all for free. Ultimately, we offer a safe place for artists, companies and creatives to take risks at early stages in their practice and make time for collaboration. This week's talk is called Queering, Archives and Performance, and it's by studio resident and performer Tom Marshman and historian Jeanie Sinclair. They're going to touch on research methods, embodiment of characters, ethics, and how creative tech led to the making of a theatre show called A Haunted Existence. Quick trigger warning, there is some discussion of suicide in this talk. There's a Q&A at the end, as there is every week, with the talk running at roughly 35 minutes. If you want to ask any questions, make any comments, or give us some feedback, you can drop them into the chat window and I'll pick them out as we go to ask the speakers at the end. There's going to be a link to a podcast that Jeannie and Tom have worked on later on in the talk. Keep an eye out for that in the chat window. Do feel free to post things as we go. Or if you want, you can tweet your question to us at PM Studio UK and I'll pick them up on there. A captioned and recorded version of the talk will be available here after the talk is finished. Next week's talk is Dreaming Future Places by Jess and Paul from Uninvited Guests, who will introduce their AR projects, Millennium and the Future Places Toolkit, and they'll discuss whether creative tech and sci-fi storytelling can inspire people to imagine better futures for their places. We've even now got a handy add to your calendar feature for all our upcoming talks, so you can click on that, add them to your digital diaries and get a reminder ensuring you never miss a talk again. You can get news on all of our future talks by following us on @PM Studio UK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our newsletter on our website, which goes out every month. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel while you're watching me talk and give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please do share the link now. It's live and can be shared all over social media and can be shared after the talk as well for people to watch again. If you have an idea for your own lunchtime talk, stay tuned for the end when I'll tell you about how you can get in touch with us to talk about that. For now, I'm going to hand you over to Tom Marshman.
There's a summer place where it may rain or storm, yeah, I'm safe and warm from within that summer place. Your arms reach out to me and my heart will be without care. Last year, I heard a story that was so shocking, I really wanted to know more about it. It happened in 1953 and involved a 17-year-old schoolboy. He was called Geoffrey Patrick Williamson, and he was from Marlow in Buckinghamshire. And apparently he got into conversation with a man in the same carriage and made an improper advance. And this man, he turned out to be an undercover railway officer. He was taken off the train and questioned at Taunton police station, where he said to the arresting officers, "You may find these things morally wrong. I don't." And then he provided the police with names of men that he'd met and had sex with. And this led to a chain of investigations, and 17 men were arrested. and 15 of them were tried at Somerset's Assize Court behind Wells Town Hall. All men pleaded guilty to acts of gross indecency or unnatural acts, and 9 of them, 9 were sent to prison. Hi everyone. My name is Tom and I'm a theatre maker and I'm based in the studio in the Pervasive Media Studio. First of all, I just wanted to say Happy Pride, everyone. And what you just saw was the opening of the show that I made 2 years ago called A Haunted Existence. And I guess you'll kind of get some idea about what it's about through the intro. It follows the story of a 17-year-old boy that was living in 1950s England, and that was a time when it was still illegal to be gay in Britain. I heard about this story in a LGBT history conference, and I was just so fascinated by how the story pans out, that I really wanted to know more about it. And I decided that really the best idea would be to collaborate with a historian. And that's how I got to meet Jeanie Sinclair. So I think we're bringing Jeanie on now. Hi, Jeanie, are you there?
Hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Tom. How are you?
Good, yeah. So you were sort of contracted in a way to work with me on this show, but in some senses, like we've carried on kind of collaborating in many different ways, and the way that you've allowed me to kind of think about history and the way that we talk about history has really informed, like particularly some of the work that I made with the theatre collection and the Oliver Messel archive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things that I was really interested in when we started working together, that although we're coming from kind of different ends of a spectrum, we're both really interested in the way that history is performed. And I'd seen your work before we started working together. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the way you work creatively with history is the way that you can use material in a kind of authentic way to produce performance that is really engaging and entertaining while still being faithful to that kind of history or that story or that narrative, which I thought was really interesting.
And something that feels like has come through quite a lot is that you can, the work that you have carried out is kind of really never ending. So we allocated a certain amount of time, but the history is so fluid that you particularly with this project, like we just begin to know more and more about those stories as the show develops and as I start presenting the show and touring the show.
Yeah, I mean, there's never any kind of real end point when you start researching something, and it's really difficult to kind of put a kind of boundary around that kind of research, and it just keeps going on and on. And I think that's what's been really interesting about the project, that 2 years later we're still kind of finding new things out about the kind of the people that we were researching, which is brilliant.
So the format of our talk is like we've set it up so that we're just going to be asking each other questions. And so my first question for you, Jeanie, is like, can you tell us about what your approach is to working with and in archives?
Well, again, the idea of performing the archive is really important to me. And so finding ways of uncovering alternative and hidden histories that you can kind of explore through the idea of performing that material, and probably performing that in a slightly different way to the way that you would. But I've worked a lot with a text by Rebecca Schneider called The Performance Remains. And I was really interested in the ideas that she talks about in particular, there's a line in there where she says, "Absent flesh does ghost bones." And I was really interested in how you could use that as a, sort of appropriating that text and using it as a kind of practical methodology that we've collaborated on together to kind of produce a way of working with historical material. So looking at archive material as the kind of bare bones of a story, a bare bones of a narrative, and then looking at that and looking at what the ghosts are, who's haunting that material, and then using that and how can you kind of flesh that out to then create a performance that engages people with that kind of history and with that story, because ordinary people have extraordinary stories, and I think it's really important to be able to explore that. And I think that's one of the exciting things about collaborating with you that I found really interesting, is the way we're approaching something from different directions, but really with often thinking in the same ways about things.
And so these bare bones, like the bare bones for the work that we made together, the bare bones really is just one newspaper article that I found that lists those men's names, and that was it really. And then we go on this process. Yeah,
exactly. And I just thought that was daunting but really exciting. But how do you think that quote from Rebecca Schneider really resonates with your approach to performance?
I think that it's something that I've been thinking about before, but actually the kind of formalizing it as a process has been really beneficial, and it has informed further work, like the work that I made in the Oliver Messel archive with the theatre collection, just about this, like, you know this, you don't know this, but you can presume this, and then taking it into an artistic journey, where are you going to go from with that? And with this project, I just got, I was completely vibing off the ghosts and the spirit world, really. And so I wanted to do some other research that would kind of sit alongside your kind of rigorous archival research. So what I decided to do was get together with a group of like-minded friends, and I booked a spiritual medium for the night. And together we tried to communicate with anyone that in the spirit world that would have remembered this story in the 1950s, or anyone that might have been able to give me a flavour of that. And so there was ghosts from the spirit world that came forward and gave us kind of essences of feelings or moods or images. I mean, I think that was the main thing that came through, was these kind of images. And to me, it really felt like it didn't really matter whether you're someone that believes in that, because it's part of a sort of theatrical journey. It just felt part of that process.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, is that as a way of approaching that. And I think that's one of the interesting things about working with you, is that it's made me a lot more open-minded about the way that I kind of approach things, and a bit more creative, I think, and a bit more ready to kind of let go of sort of certain ways of thinking, I think.
So as part of the show, it felt like it was a bit of a seance. So I think now we're going to show, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeanie, but I think now we're going to show a video that is me embodying some of the men, the 17 men that are featured in the story. And this is projected on a gauze within the theatre show. So Martin, if you could show that now.
My love must be a kind of blind love. I can't see anyone but you. Are the stars out tonight? I I don't know if it's cloudy or bright. I only have eyes for the moon may be high, but I can't see a thing in the sky. I only have eyes for I don't know if we're in a garden or on a crowded avenue. You are here, and so am I. Maybe millions of people go by, but they all disappear from view. And I only have eyes for you.
So this idea of the seance really was inspiring for me, and I think the whole of the performance really feels a little bit like a seance. And some of these characters come through in different ways. Those figures are projected onto like a black gauze in the show, and they kind of separate a world where I am telling the story, and then a sort of more dreamlike fantasy world. Where you see those characters. The images were, or the films were made by Paul Samuel White and Hannah Whitaker, and I'm really pleased with how they're seen in lots of in dark studio spaces. They look really great. So, Jeanie, I was going to ask you, how did you approach your research processes?
Well, it was another thing that was really quite a challenge, because you just gave me that one newspaper article from 1954 that had the list of all the men that were involved in the court case, and again, it was I've not worked like that before, so it was, and you just said to me, I'd just like you to find out about what happened to all of these men. So I kind of approached it with using kind of genealogical research techniques. So because the newspaper article had the name and age and where each of the men lived, so it gave me a certain amount to go on. And I mean, it was quite challenging because, again, because of the way that archives work and the kind of invisible power structures that exist, some of the men who weren't necessarily, would have been less well educated or came from less wealthy backgrounds, there's not very much to go on. There's very little information. Whereas we were really lucky with Geoffrey because he was from a more wealthy background. He was he registered to vote in everywhere that he lived, so there's a really good paper trail. So we were able to find out a bit more information about what happened to Geoffrey in particular, which was really great because obviously he's the kind of focus of the story. But because of the way archives work, there's, you know, a lot of the men, but sometimes because their names were really common, we weren't able to find out very much information at all.
Great. Some of the other research that you carried out was more kind of, gave us more kind of contextual stuff. So I know that you were working in the Hall Carpenter archive.
Yeah.
And there you did sort of research around like things like aversion therapy, which was which was what gay men would have been treated as, like hospital treatment of gay men. So things like electric shock treatment, chemical treatment. And so when you gave me text around that, I really wanted to work with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fantastic LGBTQ plus archive that's really, really important, and it's got a lot of information around that particular period, and particularly about Wolfenden, the Wolfenden Committee, and the process towards legalisation or decriminalisation in 1967. So it's a really important archive, and gave us a lot of useful context to the story itself. And then, yeah, we were just really lucky that Geoffrey sort of appears in the archives sometime after his arrest, when he's in his 20s, and he's living in a shared house in London, a house of multiple occupancy, or a kind of lodging house. And he registers to vote at every address. He moves around a few times, but he registers to vote at every address that he's at. So we're able to kind of follow him around for a few years until the kind of trail just stops and there's no more information about him. So I kind of had a hunch that, as there was no death certificate or death details available in the archives for Geoffrey, that perhaps he'd emigrated. And in the 60s, you know, a lot of British people might have been emigrating to Australia. And we're really lucky because the Australian National Archives are really well digitised. So I was able to kind of look at the archives for immigration. And it turns out that Geoffrey emigrated to Australia in 1965. So that was a really exciting kind of find. It was a bit like, who do you think you are? And I can remember meeting up with you to kind of do a big reveal of the information that we'd found out. So, which was really, you know, it was really good fun. But,
just the TV crew to be there.
Yeah, but yeah. So, and what did you like once we'd kind of got that material? How did you then use that to incorporate in the performance?
So I think that there were lots of different things at play. So there was this sort of need to kind of create an environment that felt a bit like a seance. So this sort of black gauze was used, and that hit the projections really well. In the show, I used 3 record players, and they really helped to tell the story. And I was very particular about the kind of music that I wanted. So most of the music that I use, and there's a lot of music in the show, is from the 1950s, and I used old vinyl records to tell that story. And there's something quite melancholic about a lot of the numbers in the 1950s, it feels. Or there's songs that really feel like they provide an interesting subtext for it. So there's like The Great Pretender, feels like one. Only Have Eyes for You, which we've just seen. That just felt really about, like, to me, when I heard that song, it felt really much more about like cruising, which would be where, you know, Geoffrey would have met a lot of the men, I think. So I was kind of particular in finding the songs that tell that story. I heard as well in one newspaper article that was found that there was a wife of one of the men who sadly committed suicide in prison, and she went to the inquest, and she delivered quite an impassioned speech that's recorded in the paper. And I found this track that really felt like it was it was her voice. So I embody her, I'm projected on, dressed as her, and I tried to lip sync this song. So there's those types of things, the music and the look of the show. And then the kind of information that you gave me. So the stuff about the aversion therapy, I just wanted to try and find a way that I could tell that information that would be sort of engaging and action that would conjure up that. So I decided to tell that, or to deliver that piece of text standing on my head, which that's not the kind of thing that I do really in my day-to-day life. So it felt like it was presenting a very physical, visceral challenge for me to do that. So I would be up against the back wall telling the very harsh details of what aversion therapy and electric shock treatment would be. And then there was you kind of came to me and you had like another reading of that.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because you'd kind of just done that, you know, without having us discussed it before, but also that being upside down, the idea of a word in the 1950s, invert or inversion was often used as a way of describing people who were gay. And it was just really interesting that you'd kind of chosen to kind of embody that and without knowing that already. And I thought that was fascinating and it really worked.
So you talked about Jeffrey emigrating to Australia and the kind of the research that you did around that. But if we could probably go a little bit further now into that, because you sent an email out after you found a little bit more about Jeffrey, and that kind of provides the show with its kind of happy ending, really. Can you tell us about that, how that came around, that sending that email?
Yeah, so I mean, it couldn't have been more exciting, because when we first started working on this, I did think it's just going to be a sad, tragic story. And once I'd found that Jeffrey had emigrated to Australia, I can't remember why I was going back looking at all the details of the information that I'd already got. But I happened to notice that every house that he'd lived in London, there was another man who'd also lived at all the same addresses, called John Samuels. And just on a whim, I put his name also into the Australian National Archives and discovered that he'd emigrated to Australia at the same time as Jeffrey, and they'd shared a cabin. And so I thought, oh, hang on a second, this is really interesting. So they're obviously friends at the very least. And after finding that out, I kind of searched the Sydney Morning Herald records, and sadly I found an obituary for Jeffrey. He died in 1995, and it was John that put the obituary notice in the newspaper, and his funeral was to be held at the Clovelly Bowls and Recreation Club in Sydney, which is near Bondi Beach, because John was president of the Bowls Club at the time. And I just thought, isn't that amazing? So we didn't exactly know that they were a couple by that point. And I just thought, I'll just email. I looked up Clovelly Bowls Club. It's still there. It looks amazing. And there was an email address, and I thought I'll just send them an email and see what happens, not really expecting a response. And I just got this fabulous, beautifully written email back from a man called John Duffy, who is the current president of the Bowls Club.
And so we showed those that email exchange to another collaborator, Kid Carpet, who wrote some of the music that I sing in the show, and it was transformed into a song that I sing in the show. We're going to play that now, but before we do that, just because we got this lunchtime talk gig, I actually thought that it might be fun to email again to say, well, thanks so much for the email, and we've made it into a song, and so you kind of carried that new exchange forward.
Yeah, so we thought about doing it before, but it is a bit was just a bit weird because you hadn't really told John Duffy all of the details about what the performance was about and about Jeffrey's kind of early life and whether he knew about any of that or, you know. So we thought we ought to just email him again and say, look, we've made this beautiful song out of your beautiful email and we thought you'd like to hear it. And we just got a fantastic response back, and he just sounds like such a lovely man. And he said that his daughter's gay, and so that's why one of the reasons that the story kind of resonated with him. So he was really thrilled that we'd made it into a song, which was great. So it couldn't really have been any better. It just goes to show how the research process is kind of never ending. It kind of keeps going, and there's, you know, it's still a working project, I guess, isn't it?
And to add to that, like as I was touring the show, one of Jeffrey's relatives got in touch with me as well. So it does feel like you're just accumulating slowly some knowledge.
Yeah, it's got a real afterlife, if you like, you know, that it just keeps on going.
And who knows what's going to happen from doing this lunchtime talk? Maybe someone might get in contact with even more information.
Yeah, which would be amazing.
So we're gonna play the song now. You're not going to hear me singing it because Kid Carpet can do a better version than me. So we're going to play that. And alongside the song, we've just attached some photos that were sent in this most recent email exchange. Some of the bowling club, some of John. And I think, did you put some of the immigration cards in as well?
Yeah, there's some of the archive material that's in there that's about their kind of journey, and sadly no photos of Jeffrey, but some lovely photos of John.
Great. So if you can play that, Martin, that would be brilliant.
Jeffrey Patrick Williamson and his lifelong companion and partner, John Samuels, emigrated to Australia together in 1965. And they'd enjoy many evenings drinking and overlooking the sea at the Clovelly Bowls and Recreation Club in Sydney. That's where they'd spend their time, living out their own happy ending. You can wear your whites, now the sky is blue, and the lawns are all green, and the sun shines golden. Baby, open your eyes, the best views in Sydney. Reflecting on Jeffrey, how'd you like your Campari? With soda and ice? Spirit guides, beloved ancestors, angels of the divine, we ask you for your guidance and protection as we invite you to share your stories with us in this safe and protected room tonight. Come on, step inside where the beer is cold and the barbecue works. All the members are close by to lend you a hand, whiling away the good times round the corner from Bondi, gazing out at the coastline, sometimes dolphins and whales. During the research for this show, I wrote to the bowling club where Jeffrey and John used to hang out, and hey, I got a reply. Here's the email. Hi Tom, John Duffy is my name and I am the Honorary Secretary of Clovelly Bowling and Recreation Club. It's a lawn bowling club. John Samuels was a much loved and popular club identity. In his time with the club, he was president, vice president and director, so the club has lots of memories about John. Unfortunately, his partner Jeff was not so well known. Jeff died many years before John, and I only met him once. We were both patients in the same hospital, but John always spoke so lovingly of him. I don't think the game of lawn bowls had the attraction to Jeff, as it did for John, who was never observed playing bowls, but would join John for a drink or two, or 3, or 4, or many more. They both didn't mind a drink. From what I recall, Jeff was more interested in theatre and the arts in general. They had a big golden Labrador, which they would walk together on the oval adjacent to the club. How they doted on that dog. Both men had a similar physique, large, overweight, and loud. Please make contact again. Regards, John Duffy. If you don't like it here, you can move away and find a new home. It's a long way to go, half the way round the world. You can't get here by train. Take a boat or a plane, and now you're half the way home. Put some sun in your soul. All that darkness seems so long ago. Altered so many lives, families, husbands and wives. Jeffrey lived in the past, but not the words that he spoke. You may find these things immoral. Well, I don't. Jeffrey Patrick Williamson, Angel of the Divine. Happy ending.
Thank you. It feels always just, even when I've sung that song so many times, it still feels really emotional, and just listening to it again, it's just like, it's such a beautiful song that Ed wrote for us. We're just going to go into the last question now, Jeanie, which I think is...
Yeah, so the show toured last year, and I just wanted to know a bit more about how you made that relevant, because it's a very local story in some ways to the Southwest. How did you make the show relevant to local audiences on the tour?
So the UK tour was, quite diverse in the different places that I was going to, but this story is not an isolated incident. Like there was lots of gay witch hunts in the 1950s. And of course, there's always been LGBTQ plus people. It's just that it's harder to find those stories in the archive. So I just chose 3 locations, which was, I wanted them to feel quite different. So I chose Chepstow, Newcastle and Battersea. And I worked with local groups and local archives to try to uncover stories in that area, and also try to empower those groups to try to find similar stories for themselves, so that it could go about, working in archives in their own way. And I mean, those stories that we found, 3 stories, are absolutely fascinating, and they range. They're quite diverse, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really fascinating stories that we kind of were able to uncover, and it's really difficult trying to find LGBTQ plus stories in the archives, because it's another thing that's sort of suppressed or silenced within the archive, because everyone's kind of assumed to be, straight, white and heterosexual. So it's quite hard to sometimes to find those stories. But yeah, some of them are really interesting. But again, we see the same kinds of themes emerging as well. So some of the stories are quite sad and quite tragic, and we see the same things again with like police persecution and entrapment quite often, and again themes of suicide. But we had, I mean, the story in Newcastle about Jenny was particularly an exciting story as well. I mean, they're all really interesting, but that was probably my favourite of all the ones that you found.
I feel like Jenny is a new show in the waiting for me.
Definitely.
They are quite diverse, so they do range from gender identities, legalities, and normalities. I put, which is the form of it takes the form of really just this amazing diary that's so well kept throughout the 50s, 60s.
Yeah, the Halley Diary. Yeah, it's right from is it the late 1940s right up until the early 90s.
Yeah, so we got that in the Wandsworth collection.
Yeah.
Wandsworth Archive. And, one of the things that I felt really proud about this project and the kind of life after is the podcast that we've made. So we've made 3 short podcasts around them. There's some beautiful pictures of the characters and the link of the archive, and we're going to put that in the chat now of the podcast so that people can listen to it at their leisure.
Yeah, you can find it. It's a Haunted Existence podcast on SoundCloud, I think.
Yeah, and that's really it for Haunted Existence. Did you want to add anything more, Jeanie?
I think that's it, Tom. Thanks.
Right. So I just wanted to quickly say about all the stuff that I've been up to since lockdown, because it feels like, as well as reflecting back, I've been trying to make work, stuck in my flat in Old Market. And I'm currently writing a play around the friendship of Kenneth Williams and Maggie Smith. And it's not really something that is that well documented, but they were really close friends. And I've been going through a lot of Kenneth Williams' diaries and biographies of Maggie Smith and trying to create now a film where I play both Kenneth and Maggie and their conversation together. So it's a bit about their relationship, but it's also about how when one friend passes, how some of their mannerisms and their personality live on through the person that is living. And you can really see that through Maggie Smith. Someone has written that, Maggie Smith's character in Downton Abbey is basically just Kenneth Williams in drag, which I'm quite fascinated about. As part of the process, and kind of inspired by the research process that me and Jeanie have gone through, I've actually written a letter to Maggie Smith. Have not had any response yet. So if anyone is watching has got links to Maggie Smith, then please get in touch and tell me a really good way. And just follow my development in that work. It's going to be called A Shining Intimacy. And more or less, that's what I've been up to during lockdown. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom and Jeanie. That was amazing. And that video, the story of them in Australia was a lot for a Friday afternoon in lockdown. The questions are coming through already, so I'm going to start firing some off at you. One of the first ones is, what are the ethics around researching and making a performance around real people who may still be alive or have family who are?
Shall I go first on that one, Tom?
Yeah.
So initially I was really quite uncomfortable with the idea of researching people who might still be alive or whose families might get to see the show or hear about the show. And so Tom and I had quite a, ethics is, to me as a historian and a researcher, ethics is really important to me, and it's something that's got really high priority. So I had to talk to Tom about that and just say, I'm not really sure about this. And we had quite a deep conversation. And then actually Tom, the way that Tom presented it, and actually the importance of it, just because the story was quite tragic and it's quite dark and might be something that people are kind of ashamed of and want to keep hidden, that when I talked to Tom about it, you can explain your response.
Well, I just felt like, being a gay man, that story is also part of my history. So it can't just be claimed as one person's history. I felt like I had a relationship to it. And of course I would deal with it with sensitivity and kindness, but I also wanted to to put it out there so that people know that story. You wouldn't protect it in the same way if it was a straight story, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think that was really important, and it completely changed my point of view in that idea of like, actually, this isn't something that should be shameful, and it shouldn't be hidden, and it shouldn't be a skeleton in the closet, and it's just something that's important for these stories to be told, really.
And it's something that you talked about, Jeanie, quite a lot, is this rehabilitating of history, which I feel like that is part of it. So to present this show, to talk about it does that, really. Yeah,
it's important that those stories are told.
The rehabilitation of history is a delightful phrase. I really kind of moving on slightly from that, Ruth Hecht asks, how has working with archival material changed your practice, Tom? And would you do work now that isn't based on real people?
Would I do work that isn't based on real people? I would, but somehow I find that it's such a treat to work with real stories that they give me the key, and then I'm well in there much quicker. So it's like a shortcut, really. And now that I've sort of had this developed practice through working with Jeanie about the bones, the flesh, and the ghosts, I feel like I've got this shorthand approach, and they're endless, really. The real stories. So I think it does involve a lot of imagination, though, to take it, to create the flesh of those stories.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well that, again, it's like ordinary people have extraordinary stories, and I think that's why your work is interesting, is because it's not that you wouldn't connect with a fictional character, but I think the fact that you're working with real stories and real people's lives, I think that's what makes it more powerful. And there's something really powerful about the fact that that is a real person and a real person's story.
What I'm struggling with now with this new piece about Kenneth Williams and Maggie Smith is I'm also writing myself into this piece and my relationship to them. And I'm actually really struggling to write myself in. Everything I write about me was really like massively self-indulgent because it's not come from somewhere apart from my own body.
Do you think, it's another one from Ruth, who's asking some great questions.
I love Ruth.
Do you think it matters if audiences think the narrative is historically accurate, even though there's only the bare bones of narrative which is actually known? Jeanie, maybe you could kick us off with it.
Again, this is why I really like working with Tom, because there's lots of different ways of working with historical material, and people use it in lots of different ways where you might have, some really basic information, and people then create, quite a fictional narrative, a speculative narrative out of that, and that's also fine. But I liked working with Tom because actually there's nothing in the show really that is like that. It's all very true to the material and really quite faithful to the history, and it made me, again, I was really happy about working in that way, because although it is this fantastic, really powerful, engaging, entertaining performance, it's still really faithful to the historical material, and it's still really quite rigorous, and that's why, that's important to me. And although there are kind of gaps that Tom's filled in creatively, it's still essentially historically really accurate, and I that's important to me.
I think because I've done works as well that the history is the historical stuff is quite slight and the imaginative stuff is much wider, and I think it's about the context that you place that with right at the beginning. And I've actually suddenly occurred to me that I just wanted to add another note to that about providing a context at the beginning of a piece of work, which is around like some difficult language that you might find in archives around race or terms for difficult words for sexuality or gender, which, and I work with, when I worked in the Oliver Messel archive, I had this kind of opening statement, which is something along the lines of, you know, in order to be authentic, I'm keeping to the words that I found in the archive, although some of those words might be difficult to hear to a modern ear. And I think the same is true, although it's a completely different point, the same is true about fact and fiction.
Yeah, and we had a real to and fro. That went on for ages, didn't we? You know, discussing about how to work with that material and how to use it and what should be kept in and what should be left out. And again, I think it was down to that kind of authenticity and really talking about, actually, if you're using that language, it tells you something about attitudes at the time, which is really important to the kind of history and the context. And we had really interesting discussions for ages about that one word as well. Yeah.
So a follow-on question from that then, Joe Lansdowne asks, Tom, would you ever give your own story over to someone else to write?
Well, I guess that's what I'm trying to do with myself. But yeah, of course I would, and I have, you know, in different ways. You know, some people are collecting, you know, but I'm not that convinced that it's that interesting at the moment.
I don't think that could possibly be true. Jan Willem van den Bosch, I hope I pronounced that properly, said, what's the thing that you were most surprised about when you were researching these stories?
Well, I mean, the fact that we had this kind of happy ending, and again, it was the whole research process was, you know, I was going away and doing some research and Tom was, you know, doing some other stuff, and we'd get together every so often, and it was just absolutely brilliant to be able to kind of do this who do you think you are, like big reveal stuff to him. And I couldn't believe that, you know, we'd kind of been so lucky to kind of find so that how the kind of story kind of happened, because we were I think we were both expecting it to just be a bit sad, really. And so to kind of feel that Jeffrey and John had kind of sailed off into the sunset together was just absolutely amazing. And then to have the contact with John Duffy at the bowling club, I mean, it couldn't have been any better. But we were both really surprised about that, I think. What did you think, Tom?
Well, I was going to say that throughout this whole process, we've never seen any photos of anyone that's involved in this story. And it's only last week that we got to see that photo of Jeffrey's partner, John. And it sort of was a weird feeling because he kind of looked how I think he might have should have looked, you know, just this lovely, warm, characterful face.
Yeah, it's just lovely. It's just so great. It was absolutely brilliant to kind of get that as well. But yeah, and the fact that John Duffy had said that they look quite similar was, you know, as well. So you can kind of imagine them as a couple walking their dog, and you know, it's just lovely.
One for you, Jeanie. Someone has asked, are you based anywhere in particular, or are you freelance? That might be someone looking to work with you there.
No, I'm not based anywhere in particular. I'm still finishing my PhD, but yeah, I'm just based in Bristol. So yeah.
And an absolute joy to work with.
Yeah, thanks.
Live recommendation, amazing.
So kind.
What Jeanie and Tom can't see is the chat window. That there's quite a big conversation going on about objective and subjective truth, and like it's you know, it's the most involved conversation we've had for a while. Go on, straight away, Jeanie.
There's no such thing as objective truth. As a historian, I'm just going to say that right now. No such thing as objectivity. Everything's subjective.
I was going to set you both the task of answering the question, is theatre truth, but only using 4 words, and I think you've just done it. So listen, I want to say a massive thank you to you both for joining us and for sharing the process. It's been really lovely to get into that journey of how you made the show together, and I think we're all really excited to see what you cook up next as you continue to collaborate. If we could get some claps in the chat for Jeanie and Tom. There is another lunchtime talk next week, as there is every week, Friday at 1 o'clock. It is Dreaming Future and Places by Jess and Paul from Uninvited Guests, who will introduce their AR projects Millennium and their Future Places Toolkit, and we'll discuss whether creative tech and sci-fi storytelling can inspire people to imagine better futures for their places. We've even got a handy add to your calendar feature on all of our lunchtime talks pages, on the events pages on the Watershed website, so you can pop them in your digital calendars and get a reminder, ensuring you never miss a talk again. You can get news on all of our future talks by following us on @PMStudioUK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or subscribing to our newsletter and visiting our website where the next 2 talks are up. Don't forget, before you leave, please do subscribe to this channel and give the video a thumbs up. We'll be posting a couple of links to some of the further reading and the podcast in the text beneath this video after the talk is finished. The more subscribers and likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. And please do share the link now. It's available as soon as we sign off for other people to watch. So tell your friends, and they can tell their friends, and they can tell their friends, and they can tell their friends. If you have an idea for your own lunchtime talk, drop us a line and let us know what you want to talk about. We are always keen to hear from people exploring creativity, technology, and all of its intersections. Thank you very much for watching on this Lockdown Friday, and we will